why does everyone still love a pirate? Because, unless you are an international container ship captain, you are now undoubtedly thinking of 18th century swashbucklers, then wanting to try on the hat. You may even have tried to live more like these historic characters in your professional and personal life, thanks to one or two books over the last decade exploring their culture and context beyond the swaggering ha-has of how they appear in our heads. Well, however they structured their nefarious seafaring cooperatives, perhaps one obvious reason why pirates still strike a chord with us centuries later is because they represent some sort of rebellion against the system, mate. Striking a blow for the freedoms of the ordinary person, which is a compelling RPG in your head if you're feeling helpless. Now, they operated quite successfully against the prevailing system of their day, the all-powerful seeming British Royal Navy, by operating in the gaps between the maps and the territory, a phrase you might know. Now, maps are symbolic, they speak of ownership. But on the high seas and coastlines of the 1700s, cartography was hardly satellite photography. Nowhere places existed. Sometimes as known unknowns and sometimes just not accounted for on the ground at all, or the water. And in the real world, things move. Today, if we hope to survive the storms of crisis all around us, mitigate the worst still of the climate crisis, even navigate to more resilient, healthier futures, then I think all our charts may need to be upgraded fundamentally. Because in our heads and in our business chart rooms, all our maps may need to be moving. The oceans are massive repositories of life. They represent not just life's richness on Earth, nor even its visceral untamability, something you may have experienced for yourself if you've ever ventured out into the swell. But they demonstrate how life became rich on Earth, through deep waters churning. They're engines of global life systems, currents, weather patterns, wildlife flows, carbon sinks. And we know they're giving us so many signals of damage unfolding. But the oceans speak to us in another way, of course. Emotionally. They're deep repositories of storytelling. The sea has many voices, said T.S. Eliot. Many gods and many voices. And that emotional connection can, of course, help us feel a bit more of the impact of humans on the environment. For surfers, sailors, oceanographers, beachcombers, it is a heart and evidence thing. Conscious of nature or not, for so many of us, living now just feels like something is increasingly off in our depths. There may be much to fear about how life could change on Earth, and much to long for, if only we could change our unhealthier behaviours, and how we feel about living with crisis. In trying to map out crisis, the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, they cite the oceans as essential to life on Earth. Life below water lays out many of the stats there. But in researching the goals as an outsider, as an artist no less, I came to a rather world-changing conclusion for me. One based on the idea that the 17 global goals might be missing a goal, and it might be the one we need to light up all the others. The SDGs are as a basis for a lot of environmental social governance responses by business and organisations. You could say they're all actually just different symptoms of the same single problem. Our global economic culture. A story of how to value everything. One that we've been taught ever since England and other European nations bolstered their navies against each other and set sail for far-flung lands to plunder them. Today it's become sort of globalised systematic habit. We don't think it is a story. We think it's just the way life is. Call it capitalism, globalisation, the shareholder market. Although more writers and researchers and serious organisations alike are trying to find ways to rebel against this system, it still doesn't seem like something that you and I can sail out to fight or even see past. But don't take off the big hat just yet. We can hardly leave it there, can we? Continuing to feel so disillusioned that we just turn away. So I want to suggest you look at it perhaps more like this. If all our problems on that colour wheel of awareness are cultural, products of ways we see the world, well then, mate, there's nothing we need more right now than art. For art is the work of creating new ways of seeing. Wait, I can hear you. Art. Peach, you really have walked the whimsy plank. We don't have time to muck about. We need direct action. We need actionable solutions because we're in environmental, or is it economic, or is it democratic crisis, mate? Yeah, waters seem to be rising everywhere. And how did each of those narratives draw us in to take part? Now, you interact with art every day of your life, but say the word, and it's interesting, isn't it, that all of us have the same reaction. Why does art seem so immediately impractical and such a nice to have for the elites if the weather's fine? Well, as a music artist and a lifelong creative, I've got used to the idea that art involves a lot of practical hard work, actually. But I was lucky, raised by parents who knew this firsthand as opera singers. Now, I didn't live in the lap of bourgeois luxury that you might be picturing I was raised in, but it's interesting that my dad, as a working class wartime boy, never gave up his dream of running away to the theatre to sing Gilbert and Sullivan. And rather handily for me, he did, because that's where he met my mum. And yeah, rather handily for this whole story, I think Pirates of Penzance was indeed one of his favourite GNS shows. Now, as an intrinsically funny bloke, and he really was, he told me not to joke that acting, making music, going to art school was any kind of easy option. When I went to art school, I didn't realise I was beginning a lifelong understanding of art's place in problem solving, most obviously in the processes of design. Now, design, of course, is the opposite of running away from problems, but it kind of starts with understanding the emotional truth of any situation before trying to engineer a solution. Art can help you map out that emotional truth, taking shape between us and inside us as we try to figure things out. And do we ever have a lot to figure out? A lot to try to imagine? So I'm going to say the word solar punk to you here. Have you heard of it? It's an artistic movement, one that envisions harmonious futures with nature, but not as empty utopias, more like reimagined realities lived into practically and tested out. It's an exercise in imagination and a call to action, as our changing climate puts it. It's a universe that's an interesting sandbox for pooling different themes of environmental living, all the way from ancient indigenous rhythms through to right to repair sort of tech geekery. Now, it often looks kind of leafy and urban farmy, but there's also a strong through line of oceanic storytelling. Right from the very first blog post, we think even used the term by Republic of the Bees. They were looking at the maiden voyage of the Beluga Skysail wind-powered container ship concept as a sort of inspiration to potential ways of doing things in the future. But it also makes me think of somebody like Jamie Mansell, a very hands-on inventor who simply designed and built his own solar-powered catamaran to see if it would work. Right through to today's idea of seasteading, which pictures decentralised cooperative kind of communities that live on the surfaces of the oceans. Now, solarpunk does the artistic work of science fiction. It crucially shows us what ifs, but it also implies a sort of framework for testing it out ourselves. And this just sounds like every artist I've ever known. They get stuck in practically. In fact, artists are a bit like pirates, aren't they? They're mavericks who call out hypocrisies and untruths and light beacons for different ways of seeing things, who embody the truth that other worlds are always possible. And you throw their time, their lives, their emotions, their bodies into the fray with courage. Sounds exciting, no? So why are artists and their practices so absent from all our discussions of how to tackle crisis? Now, in researching this, I've ended up writing a whole book identifying some 9 practices of artists that I think can help all of us reimagine the stories we think we're in, that motivate us and frame our lives. But if the practice of art does anything, it encourages a confidence with experimentation. A very handy trait in times of crisis, defined by retreat and fear. Artists just tend to go wherever they want to go, explore what they want to explore, in fact build the worlds that they want to build. And the more they do this, the more comfortable they get with not having an answer for everything. The artist is curiously comfortable with ambiguity, following the flow of life. For them, complexity is the call of the sea. How confident do you feel? How in control? How adrift on oceans of change? Now, it does seem, I'll grant you, easier to teach engineering than art. Watching kids get their hands on science experiments, engineering tools. It's exciting, it's kinetic, it's reassuringly certain. Science sands out lots of ignorances and it reduces uncertainties. What about the uncertainties within us? How are we to manage those, especially now? We're emotional creatures. We need to know how to reconcile conflicts of perception within us. We're animals that construct and buy into stories of who we are, that motivate us and give us meaning and some idea of the possibilities. Humans are animals suspended in webs of meaning that they themselves have spun, as Edward Hall put it. Histories, fantasies, role-playing, parables, conspiracy, myth. If, since truly ancient times, myth has been the horizon of history, as Jeremy Johnson put it, well, then we need to know how to shape the story we think we're in, some idea of where we see ourselves going. Practically, reaching for art in a time of crisis as part of that response, I think simply means fostering certain attitudes, certain behaviours, and certain educations to grow the confidence in us to get out into the swell and explore the gaps between the old maps and the new territories. We need to be teaching art at the heart of all our problem solving, with steam, not STEM. But I can't do this, Timo, you might be saying. You seem like a jolly artsy-fartsy chap, but all this isn't really for me. Well, mostly we don't want to face our demons. Don't always know how. We don't want to push on the walls of our reality. It's too hard. It's too much else to think about. Maybe that's why we seem to have been turning to apparent strongmen who promise to take us back to old stories of certainty you know full well never really were. We've handed many futures over to false pirates, pretending to be of the people. Well, what we need is more of us living with the attitude of artists, a bit compelled to get out and explore what might be emerging from life right now while we are still alive. And living like this isn't mythical, it's intentional. You make a mark, and then another, and so your confidence grows. So I want to leave you with this challenge. What if you drew your treasure map? Have you ever conducted that thought experiment of the world you really want to see? Dare to imagine a context that didn't make you feel quite so toxic and hopeless. on a big roll of paper in the real world. Why not? Start drawing, writing, collaging up the ideas, the phrases, the concepts, the networks, the shapes, the feelings of the future you would rather see, without any fear of naivety or creative silliness. Because when it comes to our futures, if we can't picture it, we can't make it. But picturing it is just practice. We need to be teaching art at the heart of all our education systems to put the soul, the meaning and the creative methodology into facing and so maybe overcoming more of our hopeless looking challenges. Now, it's said that the early swashbucklers of piracy inspired real-life revolutions years later, and if so, that has to be partly down to the skill of the writers who knew how to tell a good yarn, who knew how to tap into that emotional truth and frame it with such good theatre we would internalise it. We've internalised the idea of static lands and fixed ownerships and unchanging stories of us, when in reality, life is fluid and we belong to the earth, to the oceans and the life systems that made us. Art can help us unsee the futures we thought were unchangeable, and it can help us re-treasure our place in life's incredible, constant, rich flow of change, in the middle of which we find ourselves, not necessarily so adrift.